Imagine a simple man, hidden and full of fear, without confidence in himself. He never imagined being a leader, much less someone capable of facing a gigantic army. But surprisingly, it was exactly this person whom God chose to fulfill an incredible mission. This is the story of Gideon, an ordinary man who, despite his uncertainties, was used by God to prove that the impossible can happen when we trust in him. How did a small group of only 300 men manage to defeat thousands of enemy soldiers? And how did Gideon, a timid man, become such a fearless leader? This story shows us that God does not choose the strongest or most skilled, but those who are willing to trust and obey. Discover how God transforms weaknesses into strength and uses unlikely situations to reveal his power in extraordinary ways. The Israelites were going through a very difficult time. For 7 consecutive years, the Midianites, a cruel and powerful people, invaded their lands like a swarm of locusts, destroying everything in their path. Whenever the harvest season arrived, they stole the food, took the animals, and ruined the crops. Nothing was left for the people of Israel. It was as if a constant fear hovered over everyone. With so much fear, many Israelites abandoned their homes and began living hidden in caves in the mountains. This was a very sad time, and the people started asking for God's help, crying out for deliverance. In this setting lived Gideon, a simple man who lived in Ophrah. He was part of the tribe of Manasseh, and within his own family, he considered himself the weakest and least valuable. Gideon was neither a warrior nor a leader, just a farmer trying to survive amidst that chaos. Out of fear of the Midianites, Gideon was hiding, trying to thresh wheat in a winepress, a place normally used for treading grapes. He did this to prevent the Midianites from stealing the little he had. This shows how fear dominated everyone's lives at that time. But in the midst of this very difficult time, something incredible happened. While Gideon was working, an angel of the Lord appeared and said something surprising. "The Lord is with you, courageous man." Gideon was surprised and looked around, as if the angel were speaking to someone else. He thought, "Courageous? Me?" Full of doubts, he replied, "If God is with us, why is all this happening? Where are the miracles we heard about from our ancestors? It seems that God has abandoned us." The angel was not discouraged by Gideon's doubts. Firmly, he looked at him and said, "Use the strength you have to deliver Israel from the Midianites. I am the one sending you." Even so, Gideon could not believe it. He replied, "How can I save Israel? My tribe is the smallest, and I am the weakest in my family." Then the angel delivered a powerful message that would change everything in Gideon's life. "I will be with you, and you will defeat the Midianites as if they were only one person." This promise from God changed Gideon's perspective. God was not concerned with his strength or position. He chose Gideon to show that he can use the weakest to do great things, and that his strength is revealed in our limitations. Even with fear, Gideon decided to accept the call. He did not know how things would happen, but he took the first step, trusting that God was by his side. Little did he know that he was about to live one of the most remarkable stories in the Bible, proving that God's power can overcome any difficulty. Thus began Gideon's transformation, a man full of doubts into someone who would be used in an incredible way by God. His journey would not be easy, but his story would show that when God calls us, he gives us everything we need to fulfill the purpose. After God chose Gideon to deliver Israel, he knew the mission would be challenging. Before facing the Midianites, there was something very important to do. God wanted to free the people not only from the oppression of their enemies, but also from their spiritual distance. Many Israelites had begun to worship Baal, a false god, disrespecting the true Lord. Gideon needed to address this first, even though he knew it would be dangerous. In the village where Gideon lived, there was an altar dedicated to Baal, built by his own family. This altar was a symbol of how far the people had distanced themselves from God. Then the Lord gave Gideon a clear command: "Destroy the altar of Baal that belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred pole beside it." After that, God said, "Build an altar to me, the Lord, on the top of this stronghold." This task was not only symbolic, but also very risky. Destroying Baal's altar meant challenging the beliefs of the village and even Gideon's own family. People believed that Baal was a powerful god who protected them, and tampering with this altar could provoke everyone's wrath. Gideon knew he could even be killed for this. Despite his fear, he decided to obey. Gideon was not naturally courageous, but he began to understand that God's power was greater than any fear he felt. To fulfill God's command, Gideon called 10 trusted servants. He knew he needed to be careful and act discreetly. For this reason, he waited until night, when the village was quiet and everyone was asleep. In the darkness, Gideon and his servants worked quickly. First, they destroyed Baal's altar, which was enormous and seemed impossible to remove. Then they cut down the sacred pole beside it, which represented the worship of false gods. Afterward, Gideon did exactly as God had instructed. He built an altar to the Lord at the highest point and offered a sacrifice with a bull, following all of God's directions. It was a courageous act, declaring that only the Lord was worthy of worship. When morning came, the villagers woke up and were shocked by what they saw. Baal's altar had been destroyed, and in its place there was an altar dedicated to the Lord. The entire village was furious and began investigating who had done this. It didn't take long for them to discover that Gideon was responsible, someone no one thought capable of taking such a bold action. Soon, the people gathered at the house of Joash, Gideon's father, demanding justice. "Bring your son out. He must die for destroying Baal's altar." But something unexpected happened. Joash, who had seemed to accept the worship of Baal, found courage and defended Gideon. Firmly, he said to the crowd, "Will you fight for Baal? Will you defend him? If Baal is truly a god, let him take care of this himself, since his altar has been destroyed." These words left everyone speechless. They revealed how fragile it was to believe in a god that needed human protection. Gradually, the people's anger subsided, and they began to disperse. After this, Gideon came to be called Jerubbaal, which means the one who challenges Baal. This name symbolized his courage and obedience to God. This moment marked a turning point in Gideon's life. He faced his first great challenge, and despite his fear, chose to obey God. Gradually, the Lord strengthened his confidence, showing him that true courage comes from faith and obedience, not the absence of fear. Gideon was neither perfect nor an experienced warrior, but God was transforming his heart and increasing his faith. He learned that God's power does not depend on our abilities, but on who God is. With this lesson, Gideon was preparing for the next step in his mission to free Israel. Even with such a special calling, Gideon still had many doubts. He was human, like all of us, and the task seemed far too great. How could someone so simple from a humble family deliver Israel from such a powerful army as the Midianites? Insecurity still dominated him, and he needed proof that God was truly with him. One night, as he reflected on the challenges ahead, Gideon felt the need to speak with God once more. He wanted to be certain that the Lord was truly with him and that it was not just his imagination. So, with humility, he made a request. "Lord, if you truly intend to use me to save Israel, give me a sign. I will place a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If in the morning the fleece is wet with dew and the ground around it is dry, I will know that you are with me." This request was bold, but it showed Gideon's sincerity. He wanted to ensure that every step he took was aligned with God's will, and that the Lord had truly chosen him for such an important mission. The next morning, Gideon woke up anxious. He went to the fleece he had placed on the ground, and to his surprise, it happened exactly as he had asked. The fleece was completely wet with dew. He wrung it out with his hands and filled a bowl with water. Meanwhile, the ground around it was completely dry. God had responded clearly and directly. Even so, Gideon still felt a bit of fear. The mission seemed so immense that he needed one more confirmation. With great respect, he prayed again. "Lord, please do not be angry with me, but let me make one more request. This time, let the fleece remain dry and the ground around it be wet with dew." This was the opposite of his first request, and Gideon knew he was asking a lot. But he also knew he needed this certainty to move forward. That night, God once again answered Gideon's prayer with patience and love. When morning came, everything was exactly as he had asked. The ground around was wet with dew, but the fleece was completely dry. This second sign gave Gideon the certainty that God was truly with him and had called him for a special mission. God's patience demonstrated how he understands our weaknesses and is willing to give us what we need to strengthen our faith. With these signs, Gideon's confidence was renewed. He remained a simple man, full of doubts and fears, but now he knew he was not alone. God was by his side every step of the way, guiding and strengthening him. These signs not only confirmed Gideon's calling, but also revealed God's kindness and patience, showing that he understands our insecurities and never gives up on us. This experience marked a new beginning for Gideon. He began to realize that God was not looking for courage or status, but rather someone willing to trust and obey. God was already demonstrating that with his help, even the simplest person can accomplish incredible things. Now, with the assurance that God was with him, Gideon was ready to move forward and face the challenges that lay ahead. The journey would be difficult, but his faith was stronger than ever. With his faith in God strengthened, Gideon began to prepare for the mission of delivering Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. He knew it would not be easy since the enemy army was enormous, described in the Bible as a swarm of locusts, with camels as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. Even so, Gideon trusted God and began gathering an army to fight. In total, Gideon managed to gather 32,000 men willing to fight. It was a considerable number, but still small compared to the gigantic strength of the Midianites. Seeing so many men by his side must have brought Gideon some relief, as each one increased the hope of victory. But God had other plans. He did not want Israel to believe they would win by their own strength. The victory needed to be clearly attributed to him, so the people would understand that it was God who saved them, not the size of the army. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "Your army is too large. If Israel wins with this number, they will think it was by their own strength." God then gave an order. "Tell the people that anyone who is afraid may return home." Imagine the impact of this declaration. It was an opportunity for the fearful to leave without being judged or punished. Gideon must have been anxious, hoping that only a few would decide to leave. But to his surprise, 22,000 men went home, leaving only 10,000 soldiers in the army. It was a hard blow. The army already seemed small before, but now, with only 10,000 men, it appeared insignificant compared to the massive enemy force. Even so, Gideon trusted God and kept the remaining soldiers ready for battle. But God was not finished yet. He said to Gideon, "There are still too many soldiers. Take them down to the water, and there I will test them. Only those I choose will go with you." Gideon brought the men to a water source, and God explained the test. "Watch how each man drinks the water. Those who bring the water to their mouths with their hands, as if lapping, will stay. But those who kneel and put their faces directly into the water will be sent home." Carefully, Gideon observed. Most of the men knelt to drink directly from the water. Only 300 soldiers brought the water to their mouths with their hands, remaining alert and ready for any attack. When the test was complete, God said to Gideon, "With these 300 men who lapped the water with their hands, I will deliver Israel and give the Midianites into your hands. Send the rest home." Imagine the scene. Gideon, who started with 32,000 men, now had only 300 soldiers to face a massive and ruthless enemy. The difference in strength was absurd. Any strategist would say this battle was already lost, but God wanted to show something greater, that victory does not come from human strength, but from his power. Gideon's 300 soldiers were not special warriors. They were ordinary people, but chosen by God to be part of something extraordinary. Each of them trusted that God was in control. With only 300 men, there was no room for pride or human confidence. The message was simple: the victory would come from the Lord and him alone. This small group would be used to defeat the Midianites, and Israel could not claim that they had won by their own strength. This choice by God was not just a war strategy, but a profound spiritual lesson. When we are weak, God's power becomes evident. He does not need large armies or human strength to fulfill his plans. God is sovereign, and his glory is revealed when we trust in him, even when the situation seems impossible. Now, with only 300 men, Gideon was about to experience one of the most incredible moments in biblical history, proving that when God leads, victory is certain, no matter the size of the challenge. With only 300 men, Gideon faced what seemed like an impossible challenge. The enemy army was enormous, described as being as numerous as the sand on the seashore. The difference between the two groups was gigantic. But Gideon had something the Midianites did not: the promise of God. God did not command Gideon to use swords, spears, or shields, as would be typical in a battle. Instead, he provided a very different and unexpected strategy. Each of the 300 soldiers was to carry a torch hidden inside a clay jar and a trumpet. There were no traditional weapons, only these simple and surprising objects. This made it clear that the victory would be the Lord's work, not the result of human strength or skill. It was night, and the Midianite camp was quiet. Darkness covered the vast plain where thousands of soldiers rested or stood guard, confident in their numerical superiority. Meanwhile, Gideon and his 300 men carefully approached, divided into 3 groups, strategically positioned around the camp. The tension among Gideon and his men was immense. They knew they could not rely on strength or numbers. Everything depended on obeying God's instructions. At midnight, at the most unexpected moment, Gideon gave the signal. With courage, the 300 men acted together. They broke the jars, revealing the burning torches, which lit up the darkness like a sea of fire. The sudden brightness must have caused a great shock to the Midianites, who never anticipated such a tactic. Immediately after, the trumpets sounded. The noise was loud and deafening, echoing through the valley and breaking the silence of the night. It seemed as if Gideon's small army had transformed into thousands of soldiers, advancing simultaneously. Then the 300 men shouted together, "For the sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" The combination of the torchlight, the trumpet blasts, and the shouts caused total confusion in the Midianite camp. The soldiers, disoriented and overcome with fear, began attacking one another, believing they were surrounded by a massive army. The chaos was complete. The Midianites turned on one another in the darkness, killing their own companions. Many fled in panic, leaving behind their weapons and belongings. Gideon and his men did not even need to use a single sword. The Lord had fulfilled his promise and delivered the Midianites into Israel's hands. When the battle was over, it was clear to everyone that the victory did not come from human strategies or military strength, but from God's power and faithfulness. Gideon's small army of 300 men proved that with God in charge, even the impossible becomes reality. This victory was a milestone in Israel's history. The people were reminded that their strength and security did not depend on large armies or powerful weapons, but on their trust in God. He demonstrated that he can use the weakest to overcome the strongest, proving that even in our greatest limitations, his power is sufficient to accomplish the impossible. Gideon, who had once been full of doubts and insecurities, was now the leader God had prepared. His story is a powerful lesson that obeying God, even when everything seems lost, can bring miraculous results. In this way, the name of the Lord was glorified, and Israel enjoyed peace for many years after this incredible victory. Now leave a comment below if you are already familiar with the story of Gideon in the Bible. Don't forget to share this teaching with others and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. May God bless you.